In her new book on Juneteenth, professor at Harvard University, Annette Gordon-Reed, writes about how that film put forth the stereotypical image of Texans as white ranchers and cowboys and adds, quote, "There is, however, another important figure critically missing from Giant and other defining depictions of Texas, a figure who helped make Juneteenth necessary, the slave plantation owner. Although this species of Texan no longer exists, the influence of the world he put in place continues to this day." And Annette joins us once again now, along with the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Professor Peniel Joseph. Good to have you both.
It's great to have you both here. And I loved that introduction. I love talking to Texans about the Republic of Texas. And you, Annette, remind me of what I've always heard about Faulkner's. I love the South. I hate the South. Yes, you've in this book, you've talked a good bit about Texas and the dark legacy of slavery in Texas and race in Texas, but also you sense, I think, like Peniel, that it is a bellwether and there's exceptionalism there, and where Texas goes, America's going to go.
Well, people talk about the Texification of America. So many trends. I knew when I was in high school about the Ronald Reagan phenomenon when he won the Texas primary, all 100 delegates, and everybody was thinking, this is bizarre. How could this person go from, being bedtime for Bonzo? He was governor of California, obviously, but he wasn't taken seriously by people. But he was taken seriously in Texas. And eventually we know what happened with that. So it is something of a bellwether for politics, for religion, all those kinds of things.
And you talk about the imagery of Texas through the years. Talk about today's Texas. There are, of course, I saw Senator Cornyn tweet one time that for every one white baby, there are 9 Hispanic babies being born. We've seen with the shifting of the population with the 2020 census that people are now starting to flood in to Texas like they used to flood into California. I mean, this is really, you want to see where America's coming together as far as demographics. It is in your state, right?
It's very diverse, and it's always been diverse. But as we were saying at the top of the hour, it's been much more the notion of white males, white oil men, those kinds of things were considered to be the image of Texas. But of course, it's grown even more diverse, not just African Americans, whites, Hispanic people, also Asians, people from all over the world. When I go back to my hometown, which was basically white people of English and German extraction, African Americans, not even many Hispanic people at that time. Now it's everybody. It's the colors of the rainbow, people from all over the country. So it's a very, very diverse place. And it still has this image of being, I say in the book, Texas is constructed as a white man, but that's not really what it is. It's never been that, but it's certainly not that now.
And Professor Joseph, you say this of Annette's book. I think the sense of Texas exceptionalism is well earned, as Gordon-Reed documents throughout her book. The fusions between Anglo, African, Indigenous, Hispanic cultures is unique, as is the influence of Mexico, Spain, and America and Afro-America in shaping what becomes Texas. And you do say that where Texas goes, America will go, but where exactly that is, none of us know right now.
Well, hopefully it's towards the multiracial democratic future. I think what Professor Gordon-Reed's book does so beautifully is really provide a prehistory of what we think of as Texas. We always remember the Alamo, and she has an essay in there which is brilliant about Jim Bowie and the Alamo and sort of rethinking the actual history of that. But there's a prehistory where you have Africans and you have indigenous people and you have Latinx folks who are here before whites and then alongside of whites. And what does that mean for how we think about Texas. So even the demographic explosion we're thinking about in Texas in the 21st century, I think Professor Gordon Reed shows us, has always existed, but we've turned a blind eye to it. And I think that one of the best parts of the book, and I would bring this over to Professor Gordon Reed, is when she talks about Billy Jack. And I remember Billy Jack as well. And what Billy Jack film with that where he was half indigenous, half white, and he was really on the side of what we would call hippies today. But she remembers, that film and how many white people love Billy Jack in Texas.
No, it was amazing. I talk about how surprised I was that these very, very conservative people were watching this movie about the Freedom School hippies and this half Native American, half white person, kung fu fighting martial arts expert who was, wailing on people who were actually like the people in the audience. But the sense of fairness, the sense of justice was something that appealed to them, even though on the surface it looked like this would be totally anathema to them. But they loved it.
Annette, we've been talking about a demographic explosion in Texas, not just here, but in a couple of other segments along the way. At what point does this demographic explosion result in Texas having majority-minority, which probably does now, but in terms of progressives winning the day, as opposed to what happens in the Texas state legislature with voter suppression? At what point does this truly explode? Not just simmer, as it seems to be doing now, but truly explodes?
Well, it's tough to predict. And one of the things that you have to recall is that even though there's a demographic explosion, it doesn't mean that all the demographies are going to vote the same or the way people expect them to vote. There was an article I was reading recently about Latinx women in the Rio Grande who are actually quite conservative and are fueling the conservative movement. So we can't just assume that more different types of people will result in Texas going purple or Texas going blue. Eventually that might happen. I think what has to happen first is there has to be less emphasis on or the capacity to suppress the vote. Some people say that I've heard people say Texas is not really a red state, it's a voter suppression state. That number of people who would want to vote other ways aren't allowed to do it. And we saw what happened in the last election. I mean, they didn't win, the Democrats didn't win, but there was an explosion of voting among people. People want to vote. People who are eligible and adults and who have the legal right to vote want to do it if impediments are not put in their place. When I was growing up, my parents used to say that the polling place in black neighborhoods changed every election. White people always knew where they were supposed to vote. And every time there was an election, black people had to figure out, okay, now where do we have to go? Those kinds of tactics that really interfered with the vote. And I'm sure people persevered and did what they could, but it shouldn't be that way. In a democratic republic, people who are eligible to vote should be able to vote. And when that happens, we'll see how Texas changes.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.